This is an interview I did in 1976 with Bryan Derbyshire, that's Bryan with a Y, who was a self-styled king of leather. We met at the Coleherne, which was the hub of the leather scene at that time in London. And the title of the article was a quote from Bryan: "It's the mystique, the Marlon Brando bit, the greasy motorbike." And underneath was Keith Howe's learns about the leather scene from Bryan Derbyshire. And I really did not know anything about the leather scene. Now, I am going to read Bryan's quotes in an approximation of his Lancashire accent. Now, it isn't his true accent, and unfortunately he's no longer alive for me to check. He also has a much deeper voice than I could do. I apologise to people from Lancashire, but it's very necessary for me to try at least to give you a flavour of the man. Bryan Derbyshire originally wanted to be a chef, but his father told him that, quote, "only puffs become chefs." "You'll be a painter and decorator," he said. "You start on Monday." Painting and decorating for a brewery eventually gave way to working on building sites when he left Lancashire and came to London 8 years ago. He gave up being a foreman last year and is now running a shop, a leather shop. The men on the site wished him well because they also knew their foreman as the jaw-droppingly frank spokesman for Britain's gay leather scene. Bryan had been reading gay news in the site hut for months, and so it wasn't too much of a surprise for his men when he showed them his hardcore column for Him magazine, displaying not only his ability to call a spade a shovel, but also a picture of him wearing only a denim shirt and a wide smile. If the leather scene ever becomes respectable, it will be due in no small way to Bryan Derbyshire, a genial, black-bearded fellow with a Lancashire accent as cosy as your favourite pair of slippers. Certainly he lights up the dingy, wide-open spaces of the Coleherne, Earl's Court's time-honoured and time-worn worm's-eye view of the leather scene, when I meet him there for a drink. Beer for him, grapefruit juice for me. "Grapefruit juice? Have you got the clap?" he asked with concern. "The leather scene is coming out," he says as we settle ourselves on the edge of two of the Coleherne's seatless chairs. "It's not the old thing of two guys walking in here dressed in leather and chains and ordering 2 gins and tonics and then discussing the latest Wagnerian epic at the Colosseum. More young people are joining the leather and the denim scene now, mostly working class. They like its matiness and also because it's away from the gay stereotype. There's a lot of pressure put on kids when they come out to be outrageous queens, especially in the provinces. You've got to conform to what people think of as being gay. But now it's not as bad as it used to be seen walking around in a leather jacket." "But why leather, Bryan?" "It's a second skin. Also, it accentuates a good body. The touch and smell of leather are enough to give me a permanent hard-on. And there's a certain butchness about it which I like. All right, I'm gay, and I want to go to bed with a man. Now, the way I look at it, a man is someone in a leather jacket and denims. It's the mystique, the Marlon Brando bit, the greasy motorbike, the rocker image from the 50s. He agrees that he is possibly exchanging one extreme stereotype for another, but he points out, in his agreeable bear-like growl, that he isn't just attracted to men in leather and denim. "I'm attracted to people. The danger of this scene is when it becomes the leather and the denim and not the guy inside it." But while I agree that the growth of clubs, including a motorbike collective called London Bikers, you actually have to have a motorbike to become a member, says Bryan, and the Motor Sports Club, London, which Bryan used to belong to, catering for people interested in leather was a good sign. The reason a lot of gay people dislike the scene is because of its trappings of sadomasochism. You can be just as much into S&M in a suit as you can in a leather gear. It's a great mistake to believe that just because someone wears a leather jacket and chains, he's automatically a sadist or a masochist. But even if they do enjoy sadomasochistic sex, Bryan does not see it as either cruel or harmful. People enjoy it, they agree to it, and it's very much within a controlled situation. There are definite rules. I like guys dressed in leather, and I like my little S&M sex as well as cuddly sex, which I enjoy just as much. Both turn me on. To me, the leather scene should be clubs where people can get together and have sex if they want it. Bryan then takes a cudgel to people who try to sweep the gay sex under the carpet. I'm not interested in somebody organising a trip round the Isle of Wight and saying, go out and have a really good time, but for Christ's sakes, don't touch anybody, or people might think we're gay. Nor am I interested in military uniform parties or workmen's parties where your actual stockbrokers dress up in little workmen's outfits or parade around as little Hitlers. For Bryan, sex is sex. He hates dressing it up in psychological jargon. OK, you might say that because a meagre little counter clerk has no authority and no prospects, he'll gain some feeling of power by putting a leather jacket on. I like being in charge and acting out fantasies. What's wrong with fantasy? It's a turn-on for a lot of people. I've got a friend who I see once every 2 or 3 months. He'll ring me up and say, can I come round? I know exactly what I've got to do. I got to meet him at the door in full leather, say nothing to him, get his clothes off, kick him around the flat a bit, screw him and piss on him. When I've finished, I give him some coffee and he goes away. And he doesn't say a word. He'll ring me a couple of times later and say thanks. He's quite happy. I'm quite happy. There's nothing tender about it. If I become emotionally involved with someone, he's been living with the same man for 4 years, I can't have S&M sex with them. I couldn't go out to the theatre, go out to dinner, come home and beat the shit out of my lover. I just couldn't do it. How does he manage to separate the two sides of his sexuality? Oh yes, you've got to. You mustn't let it take over. The most obvious question about Bryan's S&M sex is, when does he know when to stop inflicting pain? I have a silly method, actually. I always tell anybody that I take home that if they want me to stop, they mustn't say stop, because for a lot of people, that's a turn on. I tell them that if it's hurting, all you have to say is Oklahoma. Oklahoma? Was that his favourite musical? Well, it's not the kind of thing you'd say in normal conversation, is it? It used to be Marmalade 2 years ago, but usually there's no need for them to tell me to stop because I try to find out in foreplay, like squeezing nipples, for example, what the person's pain tolerance is. In fact, most people's tolerance is amazingly high. I'm not convinced. If it's so pleasurable, then doesn't Bryan sometimes find it almost impossible to stop? It's difficult because you work yourself up to a pitch. It's like driving a car or a bike. You know what it'll do, you know how far you can push it, and after a time you can do that with people. I don't know what your turn on is when you go to bed, but pain to some people is a turn on. Don't ask me why. To some people pain is pleasure. I don't mind being walloped sometimes, I find it quite enjoyable, but not all the time. Just as I find kissing and cuddling or being screwed enjoyable, but not all the time. Bryan goes to the loo to adjust his cock ring, which is nipping him. 8 years ago it would have been his false eyelashes, he says. Shock and consternation. Bryan tells me about the pre-leather Mr Derbyshire, a pillar of conformity. When I lived in Lancashire, I was in the Scouts and a registered youth leader. I was asked to start a youth club in a village whose members were the absolute dregs of society. They'd been banned from everywhere else. There were about 100 of them and they all had motorbikes. I thought, what the hell do I do with them? Then one night I got them all together. I said, look, we're going to build a motorbike. They said, what do you know about it? At that time, I didn't know one end of a motorbike from the other. But I said that as they were all interested in motorbikes, the obvious thing was to build one. So we did. I also managed to get films from Honda and films of the Isle of Man TT race. We had quite a nice time together and I found I got quite turned on by all these motorbikes, all this grease, oil and petrol, and of course the guys in their leather. I got so bloody well known that the police would sign them over to me for a period of months after they'd robbed the little old lady up the road or something. But Bryan was still arriving at the youth club by bus, and the club members finally cornered him and told him that he was going to have to learn to ride a motorbike. That frightened the bloody leaving daylights out of me. But they put me on this huge bike with one of the boys behind me, and off we rode around the village with everyone cheering. Then the boy shouted, "Brakes!" But as I didn't know where they were, I accelerated. We at the side of the youth club. But they persevered, God bless their little hearts. They were the biggest villains under the sun, but they were the salt of the earth to me. At the same time as he was building motorcycles, Bryan was also leading a very different kind of gay life, which proved to be totally incompatible. I'd been to a New Year's Eve party at a gay club in Manchester and I'd never felt so happy in my life. The unfortunate thing about it was that I jumped in at the deep end and I was an outrageous queen. And I mean outrageous. I'd leave my parents home, get on the train to Manchester, dash into the loo and put my makeup on. So I found my two lives very frustrating, running a youth club and being gay. But I felt happier and more relaxed when I was covered in grease and dirt mucking about with the motorbikes. The break had to be made, and one night in the bar, he looked in the mirror. I looked at myself and I thought, Bryan, for Christ's sake. What did he see? I asked, riveted. I saw me. Backcombed hair and Willie's false eyelashes on and Max Factor pan stick plastered all over me. It was time to get out. The kids tried to talk me out of going, but I said that I had to go and I told them why. All I got was, well, we knew anyway. And that's what gave that nice sense of security, the knowledge that the leather scene would accept anything. You just have to be honest, and it saves a lot of arsing around. Because of the placing of your keys and chains, left means you're butch, right means you're passive, and anything round the middle, you're heterosexual. You can just look at somebody and know what they're into. The thing about the normal gay scene is that you get dressed up, go out and spend until closing time in a bar looking at somebody who's been looking at you. Suddenly about 10:30 you decide you want to go to bed together. And you've got to be up for work at 8. Now really, is that the best time? Bryan sometimes hankers after the building site. He could earn 3 times as much money as he does from running his leather shop next to the Coleherne, and, he sighs, looking at the beginnings of a beer belly, it keeps you fit. But he enjoys supplying people with all the complicated gear, from studded leather briefs to salmon pink, beige or black plastic dildos. As we leave the Coleherne, he points out one more justification for his leather garb. I ride a motorbike, so I'd look a pillock on a bike with a crash helmet and wearing a suit, wouldn't I? At one time, everybody arrived here on the tube in their leather. Now you only have to look outside here at night, and there are a hell of a lot of bikes. You can buy a bike for 500 quid, and with electric starters, anyone can ride one. Anyone except, at this moment, Bryan Derbyshire, king of the leather scene. Going round a roundabout the wrong way recently, he collided with a Mini driven by a middle-aged woman. She called me a few names and I threw in a few of my own. But, says Bryan ruefully, not only did I get disqualified, but the local papers headlined, "Motorcyclist insults lady magistrate." It always happens to me. I'm very good at things like that. I'm like a bloody bull in a china shop. But he doesn't work in a china shop.